Thanks for coming. My name is Karen Raymeyer, and this is CodeChix. CodeChix was started about 6 years ago in California. It's a nonprofit 501(c) organization. Our idea is to help women software engineers stay in the field and stay current with our technical skills and things like that. CodeChix Madison was started last year. We've had 4 events already. You can find us. We've got a website. It looks about like that. Here we go. We'll start at the beginning. How about? This is CodeChix. Why CodeChix exists? Cool, we got another one. CodeChix exists because women software engineers drop out of the field real fast. About 50% drop out within the first 10 years of being in the industry, and CodeChix wants to change that statistic. We think that we can do that by being local software engineers face-to-face doing techie things together. So that's what this organization is about. There are a few places, including code.org, that say the rate at which we are graduating computer science students is nowhere going to come close to meeting the demand for IT jobs. There are places that say we will have 1 million more openings than we have qualified workers within the next 5 or 6 years. CodeChix also wants to help with that. So more people are welcome to join us. Right now, all Madison CodeChix does is Tech Talks, which is open to everybody. It's an hour or 2 on a weekday evening. We may get around to having hacking sessions. We may get around to having workshops. It depends if there's interest. It was started 5 or 6 years ago in the Bay Area. I looked at what they did and said, wow, that's really cool. Let's have it here. So we started one. Our mission is to educate, promote, and mentor women engineers and students. It's run locally. That's how we do it. Anybody can come. If you're a student and you haven't coded much, but you want to be more exposed to what software engineering is, you can come here. If you are very advanced and you've been coding for a while, you can come and do talks for us or learn other things you didn't know. We need people to come to these events, people to speak at them and tell each other about it. There's our website. There's our national sponsors. There's our local sponsors. You can reach us. And I just want you to know we now have a YouTube website. So, whoops, we got the last couple of events are up here, and thank you to Madison College. They're videotaping this one, and this event will go up there. And we have the next 2 events scheduled with their dates. If you want to hold the dates, Thursday, March 12th, we're going to do a talk on iOS development. There's a Madison College student who has created a game called Connexio, and she's going to come tell us how she did that. As soon as she graduates this June, she's got a job promised at Apple. And then on Tuesday, April 7th, we are going to have some of UW graduates who now work at Google. They created a test harness for Computer Science 302, and they're going to explain how they built that. So those are the next 2 talks coming up. And now I'll turn it over to Naveen to do SpringBoot.
All right. Welcome to SpringBoot. Before I start, can I first ask how many people here have worked with Java? Okay, good. So everybody's comfortable with Java. Good, good, good. So this is a follow-up to what I did last year in November, which is just basically intro to Spring MVC. So that was more introduction to Spring as well as Spring MVC, so this is more Spring Boot. Before I start off, a little bit about myself. Name's Naveen VK. I've been in the industry for 15 plus years. We'll be celebrating my 15th work anniversary in a couple months, few months, 3 months, something like that. I have worked with Java for about 17 plus years now. So started off in school. I went to Marquette. And I have a master's in computer science from Marquette. So that's where I was exposed to Java. Something interesting about myself, Like I said, I have a master's in computer science from Marquette. I'm a geek. I love playing around with different. My goal is to learn something new, whatever it is, a framework, a new language every year. Just do something new. Maybe really something that I came across at work, or somebody just sent me an article or something like that. And then, so I do attend all the No Fluff Just Stuff conferences. I have been a pretty regular one for the last few years here in Madison. Prior to that, I was in Milwaukee, Brookfield. So I do go to those because they really, if you want to get a good flavor of what else is coming, what else is out there, I really highly recommend that. So I do that. Extracurricular activities. I'm a runner. I do karate. I do Zumba, if you know what that is, at the Y. So a little something interesting about myself. Okay, to get started. So here's the agenda for today. So some of this might be a repetition for you guys, but I just wanted to get this out there. So a basic overview of how a web app works, specifically a Java web app works. And then we'll look at the Spring MVC demo that I did last year. So I'll be showing that demo again, and we'll concentrate on a few key things in that demo, and then a Spring Boot overview and a couple demos of how you use Spring Boot. Especially, I focus mainly on web apps. Spring Boot can be used in batch and so many other things, but I just focused on web apps since that's pretty much a lot of applications are. It's either web or batch, and a whole bunch of them are web apps. Okay, so here is basically some points, some bullet points with respect to Java web apps, right? Web app, pretty much everybody who uses a browser knows what a web app is. So you have static applications or static pages, and those might be like an ad for a company's website, right? Company's website, generally it's static. Maybe they have a few dynamic pages, but generally static about the company. Or if you look at like a restaurant, like you have the menu, you have like how to contact them, the hours, and all that stuff. So those are static web pages. And then you have dynamic web apps. Gmail, Google Mail is a dynamic web app. There are other things that are all dynamic. If you're using any kind of a web banking thing, that's also a web app. If you want to look up all your from your insurance company, your health insurance information. If I belong to Blue Cross Blue Shield, so I can go look up they have an app there where I can look up my claims and things like that. So those are dynamic, right? Things come in, posted up there, and all that stuff. So web apps could be static, could be dynamic. There's a lot of interactive, dynamic content out there, and a lot of big businesses have some of their major applications as web apps. They're hosted on something known as application servers. There's a whole slew of application servers. From the good old days, like IBM is, especially if you're working for a big company, it's pretty entrenched in big companies. So you have IBM WebSphere, that's a web application server. For other, all the open source ones are actually coming up, and now you see a lot of, I know at least a couple places where they use like JBoss and Jetty and Tomcat as production level application servers. That wasn't the case a few years ago. So those are coming up, and especially with if you buy a product like WebLogic or WebSphere, it costs a lot of money. And so now you have all these open sources trying to, especially if you're a smaller company, you tend to go more open sources. Bigger companies, because they have all the PR team comes in, schmoozes everybody. You have all the app servers that you pay a lot of money for. Next few things are like, how does a basic web app work, right? So how does it work? So you bring up your browser, you hit a link or whatever, and then it takes you somewhere. You log in, and especially if it's secured information, things like that. You log in, and then you can do things, in terms of just looking up your claims, your insurance claims, your health insurance, or even like your car insurance. A lot of these insurance companies have where you can look up your claims, your policies, and all that stuff. So you log in, you have a unique login to log in, and then it'll tell you what claims you've got or not, or the status of a claim, if you've got a claim out there and things like that. So you bring up your browser, and then you hit a link, right? And behind the scenes, whatever you do, right, even if all you doing is a login, or if you're just navigating to some part of a page that says my claims, and looking into the details of a claim, or what are the things that are associated with that claim, all the documents, status, and all that stuff. So as you're clicking, behind the scenes, it's sending out this HTTP requests, right? So it's all over that's the protocol that gets used when you're going over the web. And then once it hits the web server, so the web server is another application you can have on the same box as an app server or totally different. And the web server looks at this request and says, oh, I know what this is. This is something that this specific app server can handle. And so it sends the request to that app server. The app server then takes that HTTP request and converts it into an actual Java object, right? It converts it into the HTTP servlet request object. And that gets handed off to, it's like, oh, so at the app server, and that is running a whole bunch of apps. It's not just one app per app server, but a whole bunch of applications, web applications. And it says, okay, so this request, something in the URL, whatever, behind the scenes as part of the request, it knows which application it should forward this request to. And that's where that goes. And the application processes the request, whatever it is. I want to view all my claims, or I want to view just the details of this one claim. Processes that, fetches whatever it has to fetch from the database, from a specific location. If there's if all the documents are scanned into one location, it'll go grab it from there. Or if they're all in the database, it'll go grab all that stuff that's needed to process this request, and sends it back as a HTTP servlet response object. Sends it back to the app server, and the app server says, okay, now I have to convert this to the HTTP response protocol that any web browser can know how to interpret that information. So it goes back to the web server, so from the app server, it's back to the web server, and then it goes back to your browser. And this is the way that, pretty much the whole life cycle of a request, starting from a web browser, all the way back to the application, and all the way back. Before I go ahead, so everybody understands the basic, how everything works, right? Cool. Why do you think web apps are so popular? There's a lot of companies out there. I mean, even internal applications are web apps. They're no longer desktop applications where you had to, way back 20 years ago, you had to deploy to each and every person's desktop. And that's how you worked. But all that's pretty much gone, and they're all web apps now. Any idea why?
Nobody wants to distribute them to different
Yep.
desktops.
Exactly. You have control of what version you've got, right? You have control, not like, oh, person A is running version 2.3.06, and person B is really old school 1.0.9. So you don't have to worry about all that stuff. whatever gets deployed to the app server, that's what everybody else is going to get. Plus, you don't really need much besides a browser. That's all you need. You don't have to worry about the
Internet connection.
Yep, high-speed internet connection helps, especially if you have like large images and things like that. So all you need is a browser. Really do not need any powerful computer, per se, at your desktop. Plus,
Do you think that will go back? As, I think that's going to swing back as people get tired of waiting for large things to come out of the
yep, so
internet.
which is why you have things like Ajax, which is why you have things like, it's becoming more client-heavy, right? Because we're so impatient now, we don't want, I mean, that's what a lot of mobile applications
Yeah, but
use.
some people have to pay for that data transfer too, and to be transferring data back and forth.
Exactly.
Is pretty inefficient when you could have it local.
Yep. So it is kind of sort of going back a little bit, but I think it's still a lot.
Yeah.
It's still client heavy. At some point, you still have to sync up. So we're going back to the thick client again. So it used to be really thin client. All the stuff it happens on the server. And then it was like, okay, then we have Ajax and things like that that'll help us through that. But now we're going back to like really thick clients where you just, sync up occasionally to sync up. And so it all depends on how important the latest, greatest, most recent version. It all depends on what your business application is, or your core business is. And if, for example, if the application is to monitor a patient's vitals, you can't wait even like 5-second delay. You need to know as what it is right now. And so there you can't have a thick client. It has to be in sync all the time. And
I see the habits changing with Netflix, right? It's easy to stream it.
yes,
Unless you have a DVD and you can just plug it in.
exactly. And I've fallen asleep in the middle.
You don't have
Done
an
with the-
iPad.
yeah.
You shut down the video when you're supposed to.
Yep, and I mean, same thing with the DVD, but then I know like, okay, this is where I watched last time, so I would like, okay, I look at the screen, the scenes, and I was like, oh yeah, I was like kind of sort of halfway through, so I look at the scenes, I'm like, okay, yeah, I remember that one, but Netflix, it's harder to go back to, where exactly did I fall asleep? So isn't that? This is the whole, instead of me talking about this, I should have just shown this picture. So this is how web apps actually work. So as you can see, there's the app server, which is running a whole bunch of web apps. Web app 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all that stuff. And then you have the web server, and sometimes the web server is on a totally different box. And the app server is on a totally different box. Sometimes they can be both on the same box, two different things running on the same box. Box meaning the computer. Now, actually, a lot of people don't have, it's all virtual computers right now. They have virtual servers, they bring it up, and they have virtual servers running app servers, virtual servers running web servers, so you don't physically have the machine, the hardware where it needs to be. It's all a lot of cloud stuff now, where you can bring up all the cloud computing. You can bring up these virtual servers, and depending on, they're so dynamic that depending on how much load you've got in terms of all the requests coming in, you can bring things up and down as you like. That's a whole different thing. So old school, we have our physical servers, we install things and we run things and all that stuff. And the web browser could be on the same computer, or it could be two different computers, web browser 1 and 2, and then depending on which app it is, it all figures it out by magic. So that's that. Okay, so let's look at, so this is the Spring MVC demo that I did last November. So it's basically, I'm just gonna point out a few things. So this is basic Spring MVC. Here is my JSP, just a single page, my to-do list. So I can add tasks, I can list them, I can see what's out there, I can delete them. So basically, check them off once I'm done. Here is my controller, the class that controls, that processes these requests. So each one, I have a request mapping. Let me maximize that one. Do I need to zoom in, or can everybody see this? Okay. All right, so this is where we have all these requests mapped to specific methods. So here is what my welcome does, and here is my list, and this is what happens when I call add. This is what happens when I say delete something. These are all the actions that I can do on that page, and this is what happens. This is a pretty simple one. There's no database or anything behind it. It just keeps track of it. It's just an example. It's just an array list of your tasks, and that's it. The other thing, so besides the JSP, that's my code, right? So it could be as complicated as you want. There are other things that I need for a web application. One of them I need is the web XML. This is what describes, this is the deployment, how that app needs to be deployed. Here is the name of my application, just calling it Spring MVC. Behind the scenes, it does use a dispatcher servlet. Old school, I have written code where you instantiate your own servlet and do all that stuff, and overwrite the get, the puts, and all that stuff, posts, methods. Here's my application context. We'll take a look at that. This is Spring-specific application context, but any configuration file that you need, that's what that is. And I'm mapping everything star.do to that servlet. So you could have multiple servlets that handle different things deployed as one. And I'm just saying, I only have one. This is where it goes. And that's my welcome file list. Here is the application context. So once again, this is Spring. It uses a component scan. So that means it looks at all the classes that I've got and looks at these annotations to figure out what that is, right? This is just a POJO, a plain old Java object. All I'm saying is I'm calling it a to-do controller, but what tells Spring that it's actually a controller class is that annotation, add controller, right? And then all these are request mappings. So for every action request that you send, you can specify what should happen. You can restrict it to a specific type of request. So HTTP requests, there are different types. So you have GET, you have PUT, you have POST. Generally, when we, I think you have delete and stuff like that. When we code something, we generally code for the GET and the POST. Very rarely I've seen other things besides these two types of these two methods. So here's my GET. All that it's doing is redirecting it to this one. I shouldn't even have done this right here. Then all this does is whatever's on my list, puts it out there, and hands it off to that todo.jsp. And that's all. And then add is a post. So generally the gets are read-only. Adds, anything that you actually change things, we do it as a post. And that's what this is doing. Add, it's checking to see if that list already has that item. If it doesn't, it adds it, and then it redisplays that JSP again. And then same thing with the delete. It removes that item from the list if it exists. If not, on a collection, if you call remove and the item is not there, it just ignores it. That's what that does. So it's pretty straightforward. So any questions so far? So I'm gonna just start this. I'm using the Spring Source Tool Suite as my IDE, and I have Tomcat 7 server locally, and that's what I'm using. And I deployed it to that, so that's what it is. So let's see, what port is it running at? 8080. So now, if I do http://localhost 8080, right? And the name of my application was Spring MVC. That was my context root. And I think the first one was welcome, right? So here's my to-do list. It has nothing on it. I did the current timestamp just so you can see that it actually is getting refreshed. So let's see. Grocery shopping. That's my item. And just adds it right there. Oh, my JSP is pretty straightforward, right? So this is my title right there, my to-do list at the current time, right? And this is where I'm passing in the current time, right? And then I have this form, add.do, that's what this is, this part, right? All it has is a text, name item, max length 50, and the submit button, which just says add. And then for the list of items that my controller passes me, so here's my object key value pairs, my model. So it's called lists, and that's what this is, right? So that's what this variable is. For every item on that list, all I'm doing is displaying it. And then here is my delete button. And that's it. And each one of them is a separate form. So there's a form here, and there's a form here for each one of these lines. So let's see anything else. Fill gas. Schedule dinner with friends. Pick up something, pick up gift. For Ari's birthday. That's actually my friend's birthday coming up this Saturday, so I do have to pick up a gift for her. Right, so, and then all the delete does is, let's say, oh, okay, I'm done filling up gas. It just removes it. So that's what this thing does, right? The delete just removes it from the list. Any questions?
When that goes away, then the list is clear.
Oh, yeah.
There's no-
That's just in memory. There's no,
So-
there's no, it's not, there's no
Stop the server and
database.
start back here.
Exactly, so this is just a demo. So any questions about all the configuration files we've seen so far? So all I have in here is that component scan my base package. I could have just said POC and then it'll look at everything. And since I only had one class and that's all I've got, proof of concept, POC, that's all I've got. Everything else is using annotations. It wires everything else up, maps each request. On startup, it actually prints out what those are the things that get mapped. Here are my URLs, and the methods are post. And if you try to do something else, right? Let's say if I just hit, all I did was refresh that, and it said, nope, get is not supported. Post is, but not get, so it has to be as part of the form with the method type. Because if you just key it in the URL bar and then hit enter, all you're doing is a get. Behind the scenes, it gets translated to a get method. And it says, can't do that.
Is it get default?
Sorry, what?
Is get default?
Get is the default, yep. So I think it's list.do. List.do is a get. So I can refresh that as many times and that is okay. But if it's anything else, any of the ads and all that stuff, it won't let you do that. So
you find this works fine on mobile also? If the client was a mobile, was iOS or Android?
yeah.
It works fine, no problem,
You're using a browser.
right? Right.
So it'll work just fine, whether it's, it's a browser on my little iPhone or browser here. This is not a, it'll work exactly the same.
Yeah, if you were serving it locally, you just install Tomcat for your Mac instead of Tomcat for Windows or something, right? So, it's
Oh,
the,
no, no, no.
well, an iPad, you can't run Tomcat. It
Yeah,
doesn't
right.
have a,
No, I meant, but if, I was just thinking ahead if you wanted applications to work for mobile and pieces and.
yeah,
Web apps generally do, yeah.
right.
You don't know how pretty it's gonna be because you don't know what the CSS, with the HTML behind it is.
If with HTML5, it'll automatically size it based on your.
Yeah,
So-
but it's not always.
Yeah, it's
They-
not
they make
it's not
guesses and
foolproof.
now- And now you're stuck with their guesses because it's less.
Exactly,
controlled.
exactly. So you'll have to code it exactly for,
I
and
noticed a couple sites that used to work better and now it's like, well, it was a good guess, but.
yep, especially now that you have like different sizes, of like
Viewports, very many different screen sizes.
very, yep. Okay, so from the demo, couple things, we needed the configuration files. We needed that web.xml and we needed that application.xml. Those are two things that we needed. Without that, my app wouldn't work at all. And I can show you, well, we'll get back to that. I'll show you a demo of that. So for right now, I'll just kill that. That's done. Resume. So, what does SpringBoot get us? SpringBoot is a framework where you really don't need any configuration files at all. You don't even need an application XML, you don't need web XML, nothing. And so you do have to include the Spring Boot jars. You do have to tell the app server that is a Spring Boot kind of application. Somehow you have to tell that it has to figure it out on the fly. So you can create standalone applications with very minimal configuration. Very minimal configuration. I mean, so I'll show you a couple examples where, one with absolutely no configuration and another one with, a little bit of configuration. So the way things work is it uses convention over configuration. So going back all the way to when we started programming, everything was like hard-coded, right? If you think like the very first program you ever wrote, everything was hard-coded, right? The title of the thing was hard-coded, everything was hard-coded, all that was hard-coded. And then we were like, oh yeah, but you can't really, it's not very portable. You can't move from one environment. If it's all hard-coded for the test database and you want to move it to production, you have to go back in and change all the code, all the hard-coded stuff to point to production, and then you could deploy it. And so we went from there to configuration. So we had all that stuff that had to change between environments in config files. Different databases, the logins for different databases, your LDAP settings, if you're using LDAP for login, your LDAP settings for test versus production, all that stuff. So you could have all these separate configuration files, and depending on what configuration file was available on what environment, it would load up those specific, dynamic things that changed between environments. So from there, we're taking a little step back and using convention over configuration. So when Spring first came out, you had to, your application.xml was everything. You had to define every single bean. You had to define single service. You had to define all these beans and hook them up appropriately. For example, if you had a controller and called some service class, and that service class used some data, a DAO class, a data access class, a persistence class, you had to create those beans and hook them up. And all that had to be in XML.
Worse than spreads config?
Yeah. It all depended on how complex your application was. So that was old school. So then they invented annotations where you could just annotate something as @service, @transactional, and then kaboom, it would just work. And then same thing with @repository, that's for your database stuff. @controller, we saw some of those. @controller, the @request mapping, all those things were annotations. So that way you didn't have to write all the XML files. It just figured it out at runtime. That's what happened. So now we still, in Spring Boot, we still use annotations. You cannot get away with annotations. You still have to tell it what is your controller, what's your service, what's your repository, what's your component, and all that stuff. But it just assumes a few things. So, and we'll take an example. It'll make more sense when we actually look at a demo of that. So for now, we're going back to convention over configuration. And then, and then it actually has some embedded, like Tomcat, like open source stuff, Tomcat, Jetty, and all that stuff. It even has some embedded databases, I think. I know there's Derby that's embedded, which is what my example is going to use. I know there's the H2 database, and there's something else. There's like 2 or 3 databases that are also come with as is, that you don't need extra jars or anything like that. But if you're connecting to Oracle or DB2, you'll need all those driver jars and all that stuff. And so the other thing that it uses, auto configuration annotations. We can't get away from that. I mean, we have to tell the server what things are so it knows how to hook them up and things like that. Like I said, you really don't need XML or other configuration files. And you don't, in some cases, you don't even need code at all. So we'll take a look at that. So any questions before we jump into a demo? I've just played around with this, so I can, if I don't know an answer, I'm just going to say I have no idea. I'll look into it. I did do this demo to my client, and they're like, that makes us nervous. There's no config files. You just figure things on the fly. That makes us nervous. So still pretty new. Like I said, a lot of old school big companies don't like all this new stuff. SpringBoot, I came across this in the last No Fluff Just stuff last year. And so I've been just playing around with it in my free time and just, just because it sounded like fun. I mean, you don't have config files.
Does it depend on Java 7 or Java 8?
It'll work with Java 6, actually. Initially, I had Java 6, but now I have Java 7. When I first started working with it, I used Java 6. But yeah, I think you have to have at least 6 and above. It won't work anything lower than that.
And is there any browser dependency? Must the browser be able to do anything?
Yeah, it doesn't, at least not that I'm aware of. Okay, let's take a look at the simpler version of that. So what we saw exactly, the demo that we saw of this, I'm going to show you exactly what that looks like with Spring Boot. So just so you can have an apples to apples comparison. And the second demo is where we'll be using a database, actually connecting to a database and all that stuff. So in here, here's my to-do controller. Very, very similar to what we just saw, right? There my same thing, add controller. Here's my request mapping. Here's the request mapping for the add, and here's the request mapping for the delete. Same thing. That's my webinf. The web XML is always in the webinf. All I have is my JSP. I do not have a web.xml.
Does it still deploy in here?
Sorry?
Does it still deploy in your file?
I've deployed a WAR file, and I'll show you exactly where that is. But yeah, you could deploy a your file if you like. So very similar to what we saw earlier, right? My to-do list at that current time. Here's my form to do the add. Here's my form that lists everything, and each one can be deleted. Besides these two, I needed one thing to tell it how to, that's my main Spring Boot class, which makes it run. And this is my servlet initializer. So I had to extend, I created this class called JSP Web App. It could be named anything. I could have said my web app. And then it had to extend this Spring Boot servlet initializer because it's a web app. If it was a batch, there's a different initializer for a batch or a standalone application. But since this is a web app, I had to extend that. And all it needed was two methods. One is that's called configure, which takes in a Spring application builder and then maps that to that JSP web app. So this, in fact, replaced my application context because I'm saying that this is a configuration class, and I'm telling it that what I want to do is a component scan. I don't have an application context. Unlike in that Spring MVC, that application context, right? I said, I want to do a component scan. Look at all the components that I've got in this code and hook them up. And this is how so this in fact replaces your application context. And the other thing that you have to do is have a main, and all it says is Spring application dot run. If you do have, there's something, no, these are application properties. I needn't even have had, but if I needed something to environment specific stuff, that's probably the only properties file you'll ever need. That's where, you'd have your database connectivity or whatever. I just, for this application, I really don't even need that. But I had to name that as application.properties convention. So it'll look for that properties file. If it was just app.properties, it wouldn't find it. So remember using convention over configuration. So that had to be application.properties. That was the only requirement. And that's it.
And you must have one Spring Boot server initializer.
Yep.
Or it's not meaningful.
This one. You do need this class. You do need one class to say this is my default, because I don't have a webinf, so it doesn't know which.
But it's the thing that it's extending, that Spring Boot server initializer. If you don't have one of those, you don't have a web app.
Exactly. Thank you. Yes, that's exactly right. I used Maven, and so here's my POM file, right? Here's my Spring Boot demo. This is a build script for Maven. Maven is your huge repository. And this is, instead of me trying to find out what jars I need by trial and error, oh, by the way, I forgot to show you that in Spring MVC. So, webinflib, right? Webinflib, these are all the jars that I needed to make my Spring MVC work. So for Spring Boot, I could have just done it by trial and error, bring some jars in and it'll tell me, oh, class not found, go find the other jars, class not found, go find the other jars, all that stuff. So this is what I'm specifying, that I need the starter parent, and these are all the dependencies. I need the web, right? Spring Boot starter web, I need that one. I need the Tomcat starter, since I'm going to be just deploying it to Tomcat, and since I'm using JSTL, I need that. And that's just Maven plugin. And when I run that, it would, and I had to have the structure. Because I'm using Maven, I had to have Java, source main Java, that's where all my Java code is, that's where all your packages are. Source main web app, that's where all my web app stuff is. Source main resources, that's where all my config files are. That's the default Maven structure of how you structure your code. And when I ran that POM file, it created this war. It created a target, and it created that war. And as you can see, that's my artifact, Spring Boot, version 1.0, right? And I said what I needed was a war. I could have said year, and it would create a year file for me. Actually, let's try that. And here's my configuration for, what is that? No, not that one, Spring Boot. So I want to do a clean, so just clean everything and install. Those are some of the commands that you use. Same thing if I do a right click and do a run as, it'll tell me those are the commands that I can do. So I could have done Maven clean, Maven install, those are the command line things. But I just put it all together and just. Oh, I'm not, probably not connected to. Parents file.
Do you need to connect to M2 or Naveen? Or you have those permanently, those jars permanently?
Oh yeah, I have those, and I have the war, you know, that's still here and stuff like that. So. Actually, let me see if I just want to make sure that there's nothing wrong with mine. SpringBoot. Okay, no, that was something wrong with my POM file. Probably need something else to deploy it as a here. So there it is. And if I do an F5 on that one and look at the properties, you see that it was created at 7:28 today. So that is it. So it'll create that war file, and what am I trying to get? Oh yeah. So this one, I have it deployed on an external Tomcat server. So here's startup. And I'll show that where that is locally deployed. Where is mine? There we go. It's under C, installs. So this is where I deployed that yesterday. So going back to this, right? So this is restarting everything. Oh. Exactly the same as that, right? Since my artifact, it deployed it at that as that var, SpringBoot -1.0.var. So that'll be my context root. And to do was my very first request mapping. Same thing here. Groceries. Go out. Girls' night out. Ari's birthday party. Delete that. Oh, yeah. Right. Questions? It's all convention over configuration. You don't have any XML files. We don't have a web XML. We don't have an application context, nothing.
If you were to change environments, so if that's what configuration helped with before,
Yep.
how does it now know that it's deployed on dev server, local host server? Or
That's why you need that application. You need like at least one thing. So here's the one where I do have a database. It's the app. This is my second example. SpringBoot DB. As you can see, it's the exact same structure, right? Source main Java. That's where I have all the code. In this one, I just had a web package. Here, I have my bean. I have my repository. That's my data access. I have my service. That's my interface, and this is the implementation. and I'm making that service transactional, and has all the methods that I need in there. And here is the controller for that. So here's my customer controller. Right, so it's a controller, add controller, home, that's my request mapping, it's a get. Very similar, except now it's my list of customers. So I'm like, okay, current time, list, my list is now, get me all my customers, display them. Here's the one for the add, and here's the one for the delete. Very similar to the other one. Let me show you what that app looks like, and then so this is what the app looks like. So SpringBoot DB-1.0, that's my context root. My home page is home.do. Right now I don't have any customers. So this is what I just got this working yesterday. Right. Oops, Arya stock should have been female. So I deleted that. Same thing. All I have is one JSP. Right? So exactly what that looks like. That's my title. Here's my customer, current time. This is the add form, right? So form add.do, add a new customer. Here are all the properties that I have to fill up: first name, last name, birth date, and gender is a radio button. And that's my add button. And then here's this table down here. So here's my list that gets passed in by the controller, and all I'm doing is listing it out. So under the name, first name, space, last name, gender, that's my variable, and that's birth date. That's what that is. Since it's, when you do a toString on a date, it also prints out the hours, minutes, seconds, and that's what that is. I mean, I didn't format it in any way. I'm just doing a toString on those things. Going back to the code, so this is my JSP, right? Here's my controller. The add, this is what it did. Here are all the request parameters so that we can see, right? My add, if I look at the JSP, had all these parameters: first name, last name, birth date, and gender. That's what these are. And then I create a new customer object, set all that information, and then I save that. So here is my controller, and it is using the customer service. The customer service is actually this interface, just 3 methods: find all, save, and delete by ID. The implementation, here's my add service, and I'm calling it customer service, which is why when I say auto-wired, it'll search for a bean with that name, customer service. That name should match exactly what this is. Otherwise, you could use the at resource where you can specify what the name of that bean is. I'm saying I want this transactional, so everything persisting to the database and all that stuff, that's all I'm saying. I want this transactional. Figure out what the database transaction is. The customer repository is auto-wired. So here's my interface customer repository. That's the at repository. The only method that I have that I've implemented is this delete by ID. And I'm specifying that as, yep, it's a modifying transaction, it's transactional. Here's the query, delete from customer C, where C.ID is the customer ID, which is my parameter. So this matches that. And it extends, so basically what I'm using here is Spring Data. Spring Data, and behind the scenes, what it's using is Hibernate. Hibernate is a framework that maps your objects to your tables. Here is my object. This is my customer object. I have to specify that it's an entity so that the entity manager can see it. If you're using JPA, which is, that's a lot of acronyms. Here's the name of the table. It has an ID column. That's my primary key, right? So that name could be anything. I could have called it customer ID. I could have called it customer number or whatever. But that's just the name of the variable. But this is what tells Hibernate that's my primary key, that's my ID. It maps to that column, customer ID. The value is generated. Actually,
That replaces the HBM file?
there is no HBM file. Yep. If you can see the IDs behind the scene, right? Bilbo Baggins was the first guy created. That's value 1. Frodo Baggins was number 3 because I created Arya Stark as a male first, and I had to delete it, so that was number 2. Frodo Baggins was number 3. And then when I recreated Arya Stark again, that row, that value is 4. So it's auto-generated.
If you had deleted Ari before doing that one, would it have still used up value 2?
Yeah. Because if you're using sequence generators in your database, once it's gone, it's lost because it's moved. Yeah, you
So
became.
the order of those two didn't matter, it was the fact that it was
Yep.
created.
Yep.
Where's your database?
Oh, yep. I'm getting to that. So this is my mapping thing. So here's my first name for first name. Here's my column. I'm saying nullable equals false and all that stuff. Here's my gender. I'm defaulting it to M. Here's my birth date, which is a date, right? I don't specify anything else. It figures it out based on the type of that property, what that column should be. That's a date. So it'll store it as a date. And the rest are just, getters and setters. Nothing new over there. This is where my application properties are. So I'm using the Derby database. And here is the URL for that Derby database. I'm saying call it testdb. That's the name. That's the schema, right? And here's my user ID and here's my password. By default, since it's using Derby, it'll use the embedded driver, which means it just creates it in memory. It actually creates a database in memory and then gets rid of it. Really good for testing, because then you can load your database as you want it and run your tests. And then once your tests are done, you just wipe away the database, so you don't have to. So I use Derby a lot for my local testing.
Where does it live?
In memory. But if I actually had a physical database, and I need to use a driver, I specify that client driver. I couldn't get this to work properly. There were questions about, one documentation said that the data source driver class name should be with dashes. The other one should be like camel notation, so I couldn't really get this to work. So I'm gonna try and get that to work. So that way, that's an in-memory, but if it's not in memory and you do have a network database somewhere and you pass it the driver, it should be able to connect to that.
And it's Spring that allows you to have an in-memory database.
Yeah, well, because it has Derby and H2 and something else, and those are in memory for your testing. So that's where that application properties is where things get specified. Here is my schema. And here is, I tried to import it, this didn't work either, so I'll have to figure out what's wrong with that. But supposedly I can specify, if I do have a SQL of test data, I can specify that and then load that in memory embedded Derby with everything that's in that import.sql. And schema is like, that's where all your tables are. And I just had one table, but if you had multiple tables, that's where you would create it. So it supposedly, it should know all that stuff. And like I said, it needs to be in the resources folder. The application properties is where you specify the application properties, and there's a whole slew of properties that you can specify. So we're using JPA, and we're using the Derby database. And here's my data source URL, username, password. Questions. And then POM file. Here's my POM file, same thing. Here's my artifact ID, SpringBoot DB, version 1.0. Here's my war. Here's the version of Tomcat that I'm deploying it to. Here's the Java version. Otherwise, it uses whatever is by default, the Java that's installed. And here are all the other things that you need. So the other one was really simple. There was no database, nothing like that. So all we had was the web and Tomcat, because we were deploying it to Tomcat. So here, since we're using JPA and data, we needed this artifact. We needed the web. Since I'm deploying it to Tomcat, I'm using Tomcat, using JSTL, using Derby. And it's using the Tomcat's database pooling. It's doing connection pooling behind the scenes. And that's it. Oh, and I did have to provide it with that JPA web app, right? Instead of all these other, I could just specify at SpringBoot application. It automatically does the automatic component scan and everything. So that's another way of just, instead of specifying the specific annotations, I can just say it's a SpringBoot application and it'll do the same thing. I mean, this looks exactly the same as our JSP web app, if you know, except for the annotations on top. This one, all I'm seeing is SpringBoot application, kaboom. That's all I've got for today.
Where do you think SpringBoot's going? Who's going to pick it up and use it and why?
Configuration. One of the biggest, especially if you have big applications, I've had I've had one of the first applications where I use Spring are Spring application context itself. We had to split it up into multiple files because it was so big, and each file had like hundreds of lines. It was just so unmanageable that you had to be so, and I was also the build master for that, so anytime there was something new and I had to do a build, it took me an entire day to figure out if everything is mapped properly or not. Just the whole headache of maintaining those files was such a big deal. And same thing with, I mean, even now that we use annotations quite a bit, there's still those properties files, like the environment-specific properties files, right? You can't get away from that. But the more you minimize it, the better. You don't have to write HBM files anymore. I mean, that's been there for a while. And in this case, you know, I don't even have an implementation of that, my repository, right? So I do have an implementation of my service, but my repository uses, I'm just using Spring Data. So behind the scenes, I am calling, the only thing that was there was delete by ID, right? The save, the find all. I'll actually show you what other things it gives me behind the scenes. It gives me a delete, given.
Because it's SpringBoot's, and it's an extension of what Hibernate would give.
Yep. Find all. You can find, I think you can.
Well, Hibernate comes with all that stuff usually, and SpringBoot extended Hibernate.
It just
These
minimizing
are the things
it.
you're most likely to want to do to simply that. Let me write you the method so you don't have to write the SQL.
Exactly. And that's where a lot of SQL errors happen, right? If you don't write the SQL properly, kaboom, it'll blow up, especially if you have dynamic SQL. You know, especially when you're doing searches and stuff like that, and things are dynamic. You may not hit that one condition which adds a new constraint. Keep running into that even now quite frequently because.
But you can still hardcode SQL if you want to.
Oh yeah, yep. It uses HQL, right? So this is where I did the query, right? So it uses HQL because it's Hibernate. Right? I could write specific search by last name, search by whatever, you know, partial names and stuff like that. I could write specific things, and all I do is specify that query, and behind the scenes, it creates all this stuff.
Is anybody using SpringBoot much yet?
I'm not aware of that. It was just such a nifty thing that I was like, that is pretty cool.
How long have you been using it?
Oh, I've just played around with it. There's no
Just
production.
getting
So
Okay.
last no fluff just stuff was what? March last year.
Who gave the talk? Because I missed it.
I don't remember. Was it Craig? Craig
You might have.
Wallace?
Craig Wallace?
Yeah. And then prior to that, Spring Data was the other thing that I was really, the year prior to that, that's where I was exposed to Spring Data. Loved that, and the whole JPA and all that stuff. So last year it was that. There's one other, just a little segue, there's one other really interesting database that I came across last year's No Fluff Test stuff. It's called Datomic. I really want to play around with that. The interesting thing about that database is it has its own query language and all that stuff. But in order to, it keeps track of what something was when it started. You have different versions of that database, right? You can go back to where you started. Let's say I had my very first customer table and then I added things to it. You can still go back to the version that was, because you connect to the version of your database, not, you know, your database. The other thing that was pretty nifty about that was, let's say if you have last name Smith. Smith occurs only once. Everything else just points to that. So you have these unique values that are stored just once. and your entire role is composed of pointers to all these, or references to these unique things, and that's what becomes a role.
Was that Brian Schlettenstock?
No.
Because he was doing something on big data. That sounds like what you would do too.
Could be, but it wasn't, I don't remember the name of that guy. But that was another one of those unique, I was like, huh, that's a pretty cool, so that's still on my to-do list.
So is that like lightweight for mobile apps or?
Don't know, I just haven't, but just the concepts of, of that just seems so interesting. That would be like, so it would be a pretty lightweight because you only have X number of values, fixed values, and all your rows are just references to those.
It sounds a lot like the talk that Brian gave that I went to. It had like spider frameworks of stuff, and it was talking about big
Possibly.
data and what's public and what's available to you and stuff like that.
It's possible, but
And
I
the-
just don't remember the name of the gentleman who did that presentation.
Yeah, that was neat. But it was a really totally different way about thinking about data.
Exactly. As you don't see, in terms of really new, fancy schmancy, cool ideas, you don't see as many anymore as you did like maybe 5 or 10 years ago.
But they're really different though. I mean, they're
Yeah.
either extremely lightweight mobile,
Yeah.
or they're extremely business intelligence data heavy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like it's spreading to the edges of the curve,
Yeah.
not in the middle. Okay, we got web apps now. We know what web apps are. We can do those.
Yes.
Now what do we do?
Exactly. That was another thing that it's been on my to-do list, so I'll get to it
Which,
someday.
big data?
The Datomic database.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just so intriguing. But the sad thing is it has its own unique query language, so you'll have to learn something new just for that.
What would change to have Spring be in production? Just the corporate would allow it?
So I use Spring production,
Oh,
just
okay.
not Spring Boot.
Uh,
They, the powers that we just weren't comfortable without
having a
their
configuration
configuration files, they were like, oh, no.
When you can't see that in one place and check it and.
Debug it, troubleshooting.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's totally understandable, especially if it's a
So
mission critical
Can you
application.
configure Spring Boot to do the
Can it be
configuration?
Yes,
the
there
convention
are,
that
you can
want?
override it. You
So-
can override it, but then you're
But then
defeating
you're
the whole
right.
purpose of Spring Boot.
Well, and unless you can customize Spring Boot to have it do
Yep.
the convention that you want for most of your apps.
Yeah, and I think you can do that too. I just have not played around. I've just been playing with this for the last few months, so.
So what used to be Java on struts is now much more heavily Java on Spring. Seems to me.
Yeah. I honestly don't know how many struts web apps are out there.
There are still a lot.
Yeah, there are because it's been around a while. But once Spring MVC came out, and
Yeah.
especially all the headaches with the Struts 1, really a lot of issues. Struts 2 is a lot better. Struts 2 is a lot more like Spring MVC. I did look into that. But by then, we were so used to Spring MVC, I was like,
Right.
oh yeah, why?
So
I
did
go
you do
back.
new apps in Spring MVC, or did you port old apps?
No, old apps, there are a few Struts apps that I did there. Unless,
If they're working, they're working.
exactly, unless there's a big refactoring or something, or a big enhancement going in, then I would just change it, just to make things simpler. But if
We're
it's.
still using Fortran for the weather,
So all the new ones, I've been using Spring MVC 2009. It's probably when I first started using it, 2008, 2009, that time frame. So I've been using that exclusively for the last at least 5 years, if not more.
I'd never heard of it. I mean, that's not surprising, I don't do web apps, but still.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting to see
Yep.
that was public.
It makes,
Not that I can do it yet, but now I
like,
know it's out there.
if I did write this, so with a Struts app, to convert something to a web service was such a pain in the Spring MVC. you just, instead of controller, you just say @REST controller. It's all annotations. I can take something and convert it into a RESTful service very, very quickly and with very minimal changes. You could add like secured RESTful web services. Very.
Okay, but what about Docker? What do you know about Docker? That's the new one going around.
Oh.
Now you'll remember
Now I'll have to
when you
go.
see it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now I'll have to go check
Yeah.
that out.
Well, thank you.
Oh,
Thank you.
welcome. I hope you guys. I am going to post this on the
Oh, yeah.
on my. Here's the wrap up. I do have a GitHub account, so that's where I have my. I didn't get a chance to do this, so I just finished working on that database demo yesterday, so I didn't get a chance to upload any of the stuff yet, but I will. So so there's my GitHub account, and so you will see that Spring MVC. I upload everything, the presentation, the code, everything. So I'll upload all that stuff hopefully in the next day or two.
Thanks.
So if you need example code, just go right there.
I had seen that, and I tried finding it by searching for Naveen 23, and it didn't find that by the search, but when I typed it in
Exactly, then it,
find it.
yep.
Okay. Great.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I hope you guys had fun.